everyone. I'm Jessica Hornstein. Welcome to the No Not Crazy podcast, where we explore the invalidating messages we internalize, their effects on our lives, and the ways we can free ourselves from them. We've all had those experiences that make us question ourselves and even sometimes feel a little crazy. Let's stop accepting the idea that there is something inherently wrong with us and begin to appreciate that actually there is something fundamentally right. So join me, and together we can all feel a little less crazy. Hi, everybody. I am here today with Bree Clark, and we are going to talk about imposter syndrome. Bree, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jessica.
Thanks for being here. So I'm going to read your bio, and then we'll jump right in. Bree Clark is a seasoned multimedia journalist and news personality. In 2013, she earned the distinction of becoming the first African-American news anchor in the state of Idaho. She has been focused throughout her career on helping others share their stories while holding officials accountable. With a decade of experience in broadcast news and public relations, she now hosts the show, The Real Deal with Bree Clark. Over the years, Bree has interviewed countless politicians, experts, celebrities, social media influencers, and everyday people. And in that process, she discovered that what most people were searching for was authenticity. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah. Sounds really interesting. Yeah. You've covered quite a scope there.
Yeah. It's funny when you read that, it's just like, is that me? Did I really do that? Did she have the right
So that's your imposter syndrome kicking in? Is that what that couldn't be me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did that become something that you focused so much on and that really pulled you in? Yeah.
Well, I heard about imposter syndrome years and years ago. I was helping a woman. She owned a Fortune 500 company here, and she was really into getting young girls into STEM and helping them stick with it throughout high school. She found that in high school, a lot of them are told that they aren't, they should probably try something else. Girls just aren't good at math, or girls just aren't good at science, those types of things. And I was interviewing someone for her book, and they brought up imposter syndrome, and I had never heard the term. I didn't know what it was. And at that moment, I didn't dive deep into it. It wasn't until later that I started advancing in my career as a journalist that I started having some of these feelings of inadequacy. Even though I'd gone to school, even though I was very good at my job, I still felt the need to prove myself. And saw everyone around me still also feeling that way. Everybody wanting to prove themselves, everybody, putting in long hours and taking low pay and just not being treated very well. In some cases, that wasn't at every, job that I went to, but in some cases, just not feeling like they weren't enough,
Mm-hmm.
And so I started, thinking, I wonder if we're all just kind of suffering from a little bit of imposter syndrome. And when I was approached to do my own talk show, the main thing that kept going through my head is, who am I to have a talk show? I have nothing to talk about. Mm-hmm. There are so many other people qualified. I'm not Oprah. Those were the things that kept coming up. And I thought, if I do a talk show, it's going to be about imposter syndrome. It's going to dive into some of those things that we're thinking about. Why is it that I don't feel like I'm good enough? Why is it that I have every, degree and certificate and qualification, but I still feel unqualified? Those are some of the things I really wanted to dive deeper into and give a voice to, because I think when people hear it, they kind of understand, but it's something different when you hear somebody explaining exactly what's going through your head every day.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I agree with you. It is really pervasive, as you say, through, even throughout people who are extremely accomplished. So it doesn't seem to have to do, right, with accomplishment. It's not accomplishment that erases that, right, or unwinds that for us, because then, right, a lot of people wouldn't have it who do. Mm-hmm. So what did, in your exploration of this, did you find, that there was something within you, first of all, personally, that caused this, or, and did you find a thread sort of that wound through all the people that you've spoken with on this topic, and, why it is so common?
So the first thing I found is that there's not a lot of research out there. The last major study was done back in the 70s when the term was coined.
Yeah.
And so there have been little small surveys here and there since then, but there still haven't been any groundbreaking research to find out why people suffer from imposter syndrome and how to overcome it. But there have been people who have come up with, tools and courses and things like that that have helped. Valerie Young has been the person who's kind of spearheaded that initiative to kind of help women with imposter syndrome. But surely there can be a lot more done. And so as I, was doing research and trying to find out, why do people feel this way? What's going on? I found that a lot of it seems to be geared toward internal aspects, your childhood, what kind of, trauma did you go through, or what were you told when you were growing up? Did you have things later, in adulthood that, confirmed some of those things you were told when you were a child? But I didn't see many things talking about the external factors that hit people who suffer from imposter syndrome. If you've been educated your whole life and then you go to a job and you're treated like you don't know anything, well, of course you're going to suffer from imposter syndrome. If you go to a job that was not created for you, or you're in a culture and you're a minority and you're, going through life and you're constantly told, hey, for you to stand out, for people to recognize that you are intelligent, you're going to have to do more, way more than is required, to show people that, you know what you're doing and you know what you're talking about.
Right.
And so no one was really talking about these other aspects of it. No one was talking about social media, and how that impacted. And all of those things I have experienced in some form of fashion. Growing up, my parents are older. They had very high standards, and they had to because of who they were in a country that, didn't want to accept who they were. And so they did their best to prepare me to do better. But that meant a lot of striving, a lot of striving and a lot of pushing back, a lot of cultural things, ignoring, things about my culture and trying to reshape who I was over and over again throughout childhood and adolescence. That is really hurtful when you become an adult. And then going through schools where a lot of times I was the only Black, having to find out how not to just stand out as the Black girl, but to also have people respect that I knew what I was talking about, that I was a good student, that I wasn't a troublemaker, those types of things. And then trying to break into journalism in a lot of these communities where they had never had an African American. A lot of them wanted me on air, but only for a short period of time. We want you there, but we don't want you on for too long. And
like
what kind of
tokenism?
Yeah. And, what kind of messages those send as well. So navigating all of that, most of all of that steered back to imposter syndrome and me internalizing a lot of those messages that I was getting. And then seeing a lot of the people around me who were a part of the culture, who did have these systems that were built for them, but still they felt inadequate. It made me very interested in what is it about this phenomenon that latches onto people. And that just kind of sparked my interest in doing the research and finding and just talking to people and saying, like, you know what? Why do you think you feel this way? And having people be very honest, which that's the biggest part is if you admit that you suffer from imposter syndrome, what does that say about you? That's like the biggest question for people who suffer from the phenomenon. If I admit that I'm suffering from imposter syndrome, how many people are going to come and say, you're right? You aren't qualified. And I don't know why you think you're suffering from something. You just aren't qualified. That's the fear that people are carrying. And so as a journalist who is tasked with bringing people information, with being, an expert in so many different fields, to say I suffer from imposter syndrome, that could be a big blow, to your career. And so I just took a leap and said, you know what? I'm going to talk about it and we'll see what happens. So here we are.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting because, here at No Not Crazy, we talk about validation and invalidation, right? And how it connects to so many different parts of our lives. And what I'm hearing you say is, everything you're speaking to is really a form of invalidation, and it can be systemic and institutional and, or just interpersonal. Right. And so it sounds like you had several of those factors that you're working with, but I think everybody has experienced some of it, at least. They're invalidated in some way where they have to suppress some part of themselves, or they're told that some part of themselves isn't worthy, and I would suspect that that is a big contribution, at least one piece of what contributes to imposter syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
From what you're saying. Yeah. And I also want to go back, though, for one thing that you said, because you said something about women, looking at women. Do you find that it's more common in women than in men?
Oh, yes. And people have tried to do studies to show that, men suffer from imposter syndrome. Yes, but it doesn't impact them as harshly. A man who suffers from imposter syndrome will more than likely just surround himself with people that he feels are less adequate than he is, to deal with that. Or he'll, he's not going to stay at the office until 5 o'clock in the morning trying to prove his worth. But a woman with imposter syndrome, she will sacrifice a whole lot more than a man will, just because they just don't suffer from it the same way. It doesn't impact them the same way. And they don't internalize it. A man who's suffering from imposter syndrome, they don't see my worth. A woman who's suffering from imposter syndrome, I am not worthy.
Right.
That's the big difference between the two. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is the biggest thing, because when you're suffering from imposter syndrome and you are internalizing all of those things, especially for women, it leads to depression. It leads to anxiety. It leads to some of these other things that can be very detrimental to your health, both mentally and physically. And with men, that's not necessarily the case, just because it's not internalized. Mm-hmm. And so while they're walking around and they may feel like, oh man, I wish someone could see my worth, it does not impact them as greatly as it does.
So maybe being from a sort of historically marginalized group, whether it's, gender or race or, any of the things.
Yeah.
Maybe that makes you internalize those messages more.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's a theory anyway, one of your theories, since we don't have the research, but that sounds like what you're saying, I think. So how does it manifest? Like, so you mentioned, maybe somebody stays till 5 a.m, trying to do double the work that everybody else is doing to prove themselves. What other ways do you see it playing out in people's lives, work lives or personal lives, that, is messing us up?
It's usually somewhere where there's a lack of confidence or a lack of self-worth that goes unhinged, And so for a lot of people, that starts in childhood and slowly becomes bigger, especially once they get to college. College is the biggest place where that's the biggest peer group where you see imposter syndrome run rampant, because for the first time, you're on your own, you're trying to navigate life. Most people are on their own and try to navigate life. And you are met with this pressure to perform, because guess what? You got to make a living. You got to live your life. You got to, do the things. And so for a lot of people, it starts there. But for creatives and entrepreneurs, it could start later in life. And so that's what a lot of people are seeing, especially now when a lot of people are leaving the marketplace and they're deciding to start their own businesses. They're taking, chances on themselves. Being an entrepreneur and being a creative, a lot of what you're dealing with is subjective, right? If you put your product out during the wrong time, it doesn't mean that it's a crappy product. It just means that people decided they didn't like it at that point. But you can obviously internalize that and say, oh, I suck at this. I should have never quit my job. What is wrong with me? I couldn't make it in the marketplace. I couldn't make it doing this. And all of a sudden you find yourself not only doubting yourself, but feeling like you're inadequate, unworthy, and that there's no possible way that you can do anything. And so you start this fake it till you make it mentality. Maybe I'm just going to, try and do my best and see what happens. And you start to believe that any success you have after that is because you pretended to be something that you're not. That's what you're seeing with a lot of entrepreneurs. With creatives, because it's so subjective and because it takes so much mental gymnastics to do what you do already, the smallest bit of criticism can send you on that imposter syndrome spiral of, they didn't like this. It's not good enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not a creative. Then who am I? And those are just kind of a very surface level, you know, basis of what happens when these groups are suffering from imposter syndrome, or where they can manifest. But for a majority of people, it happens during childhood, or during, you know, that time where you're transitioning into adulthood, and you're having some of, you know, those societal factors confirm some of those things that you heard growing up.
Right. It's interesting. I wonder if there's some connection, you know, because you mentioned entrepreneurs and creatives, and those are jobs typically where the work is really an expression of who you are, maybe more than other jobs, maybe more than like if you're an accountant, where it may not feel as personal in certain ways from like deep down in your soul kind of thing, you know? I wonder if you're more vulnerable to internalizing that when it's coming from that place than other work. Not that other people don't care about their work, but you know what I mean? It's just coming from a different place, maybe. So I wonder, that would be interesting. If somebody wants to do that study, that would be
isolating. Well, it's also isolating. And Valerie Young's book, she talks about how those two groups, it's very isolating. You know, you don't have that support system that you might find in a healthy workplace. We're talking about healthy workplaces.
Healthy, right.
Where you might find that support system. You know, you're not doing all the social media by yourself. You have someone who's helping you with that. You know, you're having people double check, or you're just surrounded, you know, by people who are encouraging you, who can be objective and point out the facts. You did create this. You did very well on this. These are the numbers to show that you just launched at the wrong time. You know, you have people around you that can point out the facts. But when you're isolated and you're doing a lot of this stuff on your own, you're exhausted, you're tired, it's very hard for you to separate those two, because you're already doing everything else. The last thing that your brain is going to allow you to do is be you know, be objective about the situation. And so I do believe that's why these groups suffer more than others, is because you're exhausted, you're tired. You don't have the capacity to point out the facts and not internalize what you might perceive to be as failure.
Yeah. So the workplace could really work for you, like a structured workplace where you're in a company, or, you know, you have coworkers and a boss and all of that. It could really work for you or against you, because in the wrong environment, in a toxic environment. And actually the last episode I did was about this, basically about having, you know, how bosses can validate their employees or not, you know, what happens when they don't, and that sort of thing, and, you know, how damaging that is. So yeah, it could really either work against you and increase your sense of imposter syndrome, right? If you're not getting that at work, or, as you say, if it's a healthy workplace, then it's really positive. To make all the difference, where you feel supported and you know what's working and what isn't. Right? Yeah.
Well, unhealthy workplaces, that's a whole nother another thing. Lisa Orbe Austin, in her book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, she talks about a lot about burnout and unhealthy workplaces, and how that can foster imposter syndrome, and about how in the workplace, there's usually three types of people. There are people who are well-rounded. They understand, you know, how the dynamics work. They don't take anything home with them. They leave everything there. They have a great work-life balance, right? It's those people. You have those who feel like imposters, that are working really hard to try and prove themselves, or striving, or they're procrastinating to the point where they don't get as much done. Their worth and their work is not seen, because they're self-sabotaging themselves. You have that group of people. And then you have the narcissist. And she says the worst thing for an imposter, someone who's suffering from imposter syndrome, the worst thing for them is for them to get attached to a narcissist. And you'll see a lot of this when you have bosses. You'll have bosses that are narcissists that will latch on to someone who's suffering from imposter syndrome. They don't know this. They just know that this person has the key factors to do whatever it is that they want. And when you get attached to someone like that, you are usually asked to do more not more that you're capable of, but more than you should to prove your worth to them. And it creates this crazy cycle because your lack of self-worth fuels that narcissist and their, whatever it is that they did not receive or get growing up. And so the workplace is probably the unhealthy workplace is probably the best place for imposter syndrome to foster from someone and it doesn't have to be a boss, but most of the time that's where you see it, is where you have a boss who's a narcissist, who has an employee or secondhand who is suffering from something that can easily manifest into imposter syndrome because of the dynamics of that relationship.
Right. The boss exploits it.
Yeah.
Really exploits that vulnerability. Yeah. Where does the pathway go unchecked? So if somebody has imposter syndrome, where does it lead when it's unchecked, if it's not addressed?
Yeah, it can lead to a lot of things. It can lead to severe anxiety to the point to where you just aren't functioning. You aren't functioning in health in any way. And that can lead to severe burnout, not just in your work life, but in your personal life as well. With imposter syndrome, people often talk about the corporate world and corporate America. And with the show, we've tried to open up some of those other avenues where you can see it. And for the stay-at-home mom who's suffering from imposter syndrome, who is anxious about all the things because she wants to be the best mom that she can, whatever happened that made her feel that way, can obviously lead to burnout. It can look at like something as simple as cleaning the house every day to where it's, it's completely spotless while trying to be the superwoman mom and do all the things and do all the play dates and overcommit. That can obviously lead to burnout. And that can take you to the point where you just can't function. That can lead to a lot of health risks. That could lead to a lot of agitation, a lot of anger, and just self-destruction there. Another avenue is imposter syndrome unhinged can lead to severe depression. If you feel like nothing that you ever do measures up, and even when you're accomplishing things and that high doesn't last very long, it could get to the point where nothing feels like it's worth it. Nothing feels like it's going to bring you joy or make you happy. That could lead to deep depression. And we know that deep depression can lead to suicide. And they have found that. The other thing is imposter syndrome can lead to self-sabotage, where you feel like you're not going to succeed for whatever reason. And so instead of failing, you start failing for yourself. Meaning you just start ruining relationships, you start ruining jobs, you start just ruining every pathway that you can. And for some people, that could lead to addiction, where you're finding coping mechanisms, what you think is coping mechanisms, but it's actually self-sabotage. If I'm strung out, then I'll never really have to try and no one will ever see that I'm awful at this, those types of things. And for people who don't suffer from imposter syndrome, that might not make the most sense. They were like, how do we get there? Like, how do we go from there to here? But because this is something that is so internal that you cannot see, you cannot see if someone is going through imposter syndrome unless you've dealt with it in some way. Because it's so silent, the impacts are very drastic because you're dealing with it in silence for so long. And so that's why we tell people on the show and anytime we're dealing with these communities that it's very important for you to be in community, for you to tell someone, if it's just one person, that's better than you walking around and holding all of that in, because it's so toxic that these are just 3 things that it could lead to, but there's so much more destruction that can happen from this.
I see, with the clients I work with, self-worth, self-concept is such a struggle. It's coming from so many angles. It's, really erodes, right, who you are and your ability to move through the world in an authentic way or in an empowered way. And it's just brutal. And I really appreciate that you mentioned stay-at-home moms or self-sabotaging in relationships, because I think it's important to understand that it isn't just, in the work. We do think of it like imposter syndrome has to do with your work and some status kind of thing in that way. But I do think it really, like you said, it plays out in our interpersonal lives so much and relationally. People think they're not worthy of relationships, certain kinds of relationships. And so they don't try, like you said. And when you don't try, you can't get upset with yourself for failing, right? Like then it's like, oh, well, it's not that I couldn't do it. I just didn't try to do it. So like maybe had I, tried to write that book or whatever it is, I would have, but you don't sort of have to really digest the failure because you haven't attempted it, right?
Yeah.
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 I think one of the biggest things is just finding that person. I can't stress that enough because imposter syndrome is so much more complicated than we make it. But at the same time, to overcome it is so simple. There are 3 things that I tell people to do when they're suffering from this. It's write down all those thoughts. Everything that you are keeping inside, write it down. And there is going to be a hesitation to continue that list. Halfway through that list, I guarantee you're not going to want to continue writing it down because your brain doesn't want you to let go of that. There's a part of you that doesn't want to let go of that. They just like me. And if I continue to just kind of play their game and let them just like me, then I won't ever have to confess. They'll never realize that I don't know what I'm doing. Well, that's not the case. Google did not hire you because they liked you. Like that is Google actually has a whole onboarding section for their onboarding with HR that addresses imposter syndrome because they found
Really?
that, a lot of people who are joining their company for some reason thinks that through that 2-month process of being vetted, they were able to just convince Google that they were qualified when they weren't. And I'm like, if you feel that you can convince Google to hire you just because they made a mistake or they just like you, that's deep. That is a deep-seated situation. But I tell people to just write those things down. Write down. I feel like I tricked Google into hiring me. Write all those things down, and then I want you to go through and just try and investigate the facts. Investigate those facts. Let's say you are wrong, right? And Google hired you because you're actually qualified. What would those qualifications be, right? Write those down. Write down the things that you've heard people say about you that makes you feel uncomfortable. Those are usually the facts. It's, oh my gosh, you're natural at this. You probably are. Write those things down. And then I tell people not to stop there. I tell them to go and share it with someone that they trust, a friend, or someone who has a lot of weight in their life, usually an older, wiser person, and just tell them, hey, I wrote this down. I've been suffering from this. And at that moment, give them permission to speak the truth into whatever that situation is and to meet with you on a periodic basis. That could be every week, that could be once a month, but to check in with you and that you are obligated to answer them, to go through this process with them, because that is the hardest thing is going through that whole process, writing it down the opposite. And then the imposter phenomenon, having you flip it back the other direction. You go back into the lie, or you make a deeper lie. It's like, oh, I do have a degree. Oh, but I faked my way through college. It's so simple to go back and just invalidate, those things. But I guarantee you that's not the case. It's just not. So this is why I say community is important. And these 3 steps are the simplest way to unravel such a complicated mind game.
Yeah. There's so many layers that you lose sight of who you really are even.
Yeah.
I think it's twofold. Like I think on the one hand, you've lost sight because your self-doubt about your qualifications or your abilities. And on the other hand, you're losing yourself because from that place, you can't really self-actualize, right, into what you really want, who you really can be, because you're just focused on trying to be the thing you think you need to be, or everybody's expecting you to be, or wants you to be. And so it's such a loss of self coming from two tracks.
Yeah.
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 We talk a lot about identity on the show as well. Having your identity rooted, why having your identity rooted in what you do is so harmful. I know for me that it was especially true. I mean, as journalists, we live, breathe, and sleep what we do. It's very hard to separate the two, because even when you're at the grocery store, you're still that person. Have people come up to you and say, "Oh my gosh, hi," and you can't be mean. You can't say, I mean, you could, but most of the time,
I know you would never.
yeah. You can't say, "I'm grocery shopping, leave me alone." And it becomes every facet. I mean, there were times where I'd be sitting eating dinner with my family and people would come up and mid-conversation, no excuse me, no nothing. And I didn't take it any kind of way because I knew they were just excited. But I remember it would make me feel uncomfortable. I would think, these people don't know me and they're being so nice. They have no idea who I am. I'm a nice person, but I'm a little spicy. And so when they would come up, they're like, "Oh, you're so nice and so sweet." I'm like, "Ask my husband."
Yeah.
He's going to tell you something different. But it became the point where I felt like that's what I had to embody. I had to embody this nice, sweet person at all times. And I still catch myself doing that. And people who know me in real life have told me, I mean, you see more of me on my show, but that's different than what you saw when I did the news. When I did the news, I felt like I had to be what the audience felt that I was. And that wasn't always the best thing for me, because you get lost in that. And I remember when I had my son, for 3 years, I was a stay-at-home mom. And I did not know who I was without being on television. I didn't know who I was. And it was very odd going to the store here in Austin, Texas, and no one knowing who I was. It felt odd. And I remember starting to grieve that, because it's like, well, if I'm not Brie Clark, who am I? Am I important? Was that really real? Those types of things. And it's very hard to go backwards and do that work, which I had to do, of figuring out, who am I? What do I actually like to do? What my hobbies were, because I didn't have any hobbies anymore. I mean, you're always at the station. And so there were a lot of things that I knew how to do that I did not know I knew how to do, or skills that I had acquired becoming a journalist that could, work at any other job. I felt like if I wasn't doing TV, I couldn't do anything else, because that's all I could do. And I found out 2 years later that wasn't true. When I started doing other type of consulting work, I was like, oh, okay, like, I'm an actually smart person. I'm not just TV smart, quote unquote. And so those are some of the things that I think that, people are just dealing with, is their identity is attached to whatever that is, not just with work, but if your identity is wrapped up in being a mom, you might forget, the things that you would do when it was just you and your husband, or just you as a single person and you hanging out with your friends. You might forget that you love to draw. You might forget that you like to take, long, walks on the beach. You might forget those things. It's crazy, because it's like, how could you ever forget those things? But when your identity gets wrapped up in this other role, your brain erases everything else, because it's like, I don't need this. I'm having to keep track of 3 other people. I don't have space for what you as a person used to like to do. And so I think it's important for people to, if they're finding themselves feeling like an imposter, inadequate, to maybe just make a list. What are you good at? Or what do you just like? Not even what you're good at. What do you like to do? And if you can't come up with a list, your identity is no longer, it's no longer sovereign. You no longer have a sovereign identity. It's attached to something, and you need to detach yourself from that as soon as possible.
Yeah, I work with people on that, that rebuilding. And sometimes you do really have to go way back, even to childhood, to sort of remember that core of who you are.
Yeah.
And that freedom that you had, and just sort of putting yourself out there. Here's who I am. And it's just organic and naturally happens. You don't think about it. You're not picking and choosing. You're just doing it, like what feels right to you when you're a kid. Yeah. And it can really be a process of rebuilding. It can really get so lost. Yeah. So how did you, or do you feel, I should say, because, when I read your bio, you said, well, that's me. What? So, I mean, do you feel like you have overcome imposter syndrome? Do you feel like people ever do fully overcome imposter syndrome? Or is it something that's sort of there? Because I think so many of our wounds or, our challenges, it's not about getting rid of them. We may still always have the triggers we have. It's about managing them and navigating them and the self-awareness, right? And giving yourself self-compassion around them. So, catching yourself when something starts, that feeling starts, instead of going down the rabbit hole with it, saying, oh, I'm doing that thing again. Okay, hold on. What am I reacting to? Right. And being able to then to process it. So, I wonder if this is one of those things that there's always like a little piece of it, but
yeah, I do believe there's always going to be, I could be wrong, but I don't feel like you ever fully overcome anything. I mean, if you get a cut today, there's going to be some remnants of a scar. Even if you don't see it on top of your skin, there's going to be some type of scar tissue under the surface. That's just how we work. And it's the same things with our mental and our emotional. You don't fully overcome whatever it is that has hurt you or impacted you. I do believe that I'm a lot better. This show has been probably the biggest healing point for me, just because I do not have a station backing me. There's no major network that is backing my show. A lot of this is me, not to take anything away from my team, but it is not something that someone said, hey, this is what you're going to do and this is who you are. A lot of the decisions are now left to me. And that has been the most liberating thing, because I can do whatever I want, with it. If I decide we're going to start talking about ponies next season, that's what we're going to do. No one would watch, but I'm writing that down.
This one's for Jessica.
But I am finally doing what I want, and I am noticing that people notice. I get messages every other day from people who are like, oh, you seem so much happier doing this. That does not mean that I don't have hard days. That does not mean that there are days that I'm like, what am I doing? I have those days, and it is normal to have those days. And I feel like with a lot of people, not just with imposter syndrome, but depression and anxiety and addiction, any of those things, they feel like if they are at 100% happy and free, that they aren't healing or healed. And that's not necessarily true. I have noticed that I don't take things as personally. I noticed that I care less about what people are thinking, and that just might be maturity more than anything else. But the more that I talk about this and the more that I share, hey, yep, me too, I'm dealing with some stuff, it helps redeem a lot of things that I let slide, or a lot of things that I didn't say when I felt like I needed to say them. And I feel like a lot of those wounds that were self-inflicted are being healed as well. So I do believe that there is a way to heal from this, but it's not going to be 100%. Right. And I think that there's beauty in that. Because if you still feel a little bit and hey, this is what I have overcome, you're going to fight harder not to go back to where that was. If you remember, with childbirth, I have the scars, And so sometimes I'm like, do we know another? You forget the whole process. My husband says it's a trick. Nature tricks us and makes us moms forget, the pregnancy, the labor and all that. And so we're like, oh yeah, maybe we can have another, so that we will, keep the population going. But I feel like when you remember that there was some stuff that you had to go through to get to where you are, not only are you able to acknowledge how far you've come, but you're able to continue on that path. Your whole life, you're going to be working through some stuff because things happen. Yes. Once you heal from that one thing, something else.
Yeah, something else. Yeah, no, and things get re-triggered depending on what's going on. And yeah. And I think it's really important to make the point that, because we can get so paralyzed, right, in these fears, imposter syndrome or any fear or anxiety. And that really then robs us, it compounds the problem because it robs us of having the opportunity to see evidence to the contrary.
Yeah.
Right. So if we say we can't, or we're afraid to try, and whether that's a job, a relationship, whatever it is, we're really losing out on those, like you said, when you started doing the show, right? It starts giving you feedback.
Yeah.
Right. That you then start to internalize that. It gives you some data, right? Like about, oh, wait, I am doing this. I can do this. This is working. And maybe this part isn't working so well. And I adjust it. But right, it starts giving you those ingredients to build a new self-concept.
Yeah.
Or at least an enhanced self-concept that knows what you're capable of, and tips the scales away from that imposter syndrome. It's so important because when we're in those states is when we may most want to retreat and not try, not put ourselves out there. But we actually need to, and it can be little steps, right? If you're
It doesn't have to be a whole show.
Doesn't have to be a whole. I mean, you're amazing, but it does not have to be. No, it can really be little tiny steps. But at each step, you're rewiring or you're rewriting that narrative about yourself that you see. You can do it. So it's at those moments where we have to kind of push ourselves a little bit more, I think, to try to take those tiny little steps. As you say, it's important also to usually do that with some support, whether that's a friend, a mentor, a parent, a coach, whomever.
Yeah. Yeah. And to give yourself permission. I mean, you are allowed to say what kind of life you want and who you want to be. That does not, and I feel like people feel like, oh, does not make me an imposter if I created this whole, no. Nothing around you just manifested. It was someone who said, hey, I want to do this, or hey, I want my life to look like this, or I want my business to look like this, and made it happen. They didn't do it alone. They usually had someone along the way to help make sure they continued, because it's one thing to start, but it's another to keep going. And so giving yourself permission to have the life you want, you can do that. There's no one who says, because my parents said this is who I'm going to be, or this person said this is who I'm going to be, then this is what I'm going to have to do. I had a professor tell me I was going to be a journalist. It wasn't me who had that dream as a kid. It was someone who said, oh, you're going to do news. You're so good at it. This is really what you're going to do. And now in life, I'm realizing, no, I'm great at a certain thing, but that does not mean it has to be news. And I feel like there's a lot of people out there who are feeling the feelings that they're feeling because someone told them that this is what they needed to do and this is who they need to be. And the only person who can say that is you.
Exactly. Exactly. And just honestly, I mean, you may be really good at something and it still doesn't mean it's what you want to do. Right. Like we think a lot of us fall into that, just because you can doesn't mean you want to. You forget because you're like, oh, look, I did such a good job. But like, you don't stop to think, was that satisfying to me? Was I happy doing it? We just go along with it. That there's not, to what you were saying about creating your life and people feeling bad about that. I mean, I think that really is this weird message we've been sent, really in our culture a lot. I mean, especially in the US, but, lots of places that that you're not necessarily supposed to enjoy your life, like, or be happy. It's this weird backwards thing. Like if you're suffering, then you're doing it right. You're working hard enough. You're bleeding yourself dry. And that's how it should be. And it's so backwards. And when you create your own life, if you're doing it from an authentic place, if you've really done the work to figure out what matters to you, and you're doing it from that place, what could be more right than that, right? If you're doing it because there's a message in your head and you're trying to build some, empire because, you're trying to please your parents or something like that, then that's something you want to look at. But if it's from the truth, who you really are, then that's what we all should like really be aiming for, right? In our professional, personal lives, all of it.
Yeah. I tell people all the time that imposter syndrome is the opposite of self-love. It just really is. And for one of our episodes, we had Erica Marcoux come on. She's a mindfulness coach here in Austin. And she just talked about how her life after COVID is a lot different than her life was before. And it's not because of the isolation and all the things. It's mostly because she had time to dive into self-love, self-compassion, really figuring out what Erica needed, what she needed, and what her life was going to look like if she wanted to be happy. And for her, that meant cutting some people out, of her life and saying, you know what, I have too many of y'all in this kitchen and I need you all to get out. And so I really commend her for that, because on the other side of imposter syndrome, I mean, we talk a lot about community and how it's needed, right? But what I want to clarify is it's community that cares about you, that cares about you being happy and cares about you being successful. These are not just, hey, I found these group of people and, let's talk together. It's, do they want what's best for you? Do they care about you? Are the things that they're saying, is it giving you life, or do you feel depleted every time you're around them? People can give you backhanded compliments. They can pretend they're helping you, and all the while the narcissist is causing you pain. It's, oh, they came for me for help. And for you to continue being in their lives, they have to keep you wounded. And so that is something that I would tell people to steer clear from. You get a say in what your life looks like, which means you get a say on who is in your life, who gets to go along for a ride. And if that parent in your life is causing you pain and anguish, you love them, you care for them, but there needs to be some boundaries put in place, or you're not going to be able to overcome imposter syndrome, because parents can grab you and push those buttons like no one else can. They know where they all are. They created you. They know where they are. And while we like to believe that all parents are loving and care about us and want the best for us, sometimes they want the best for them. And that does not mean the best for you.
And partners as well.
Yes, and partners
as well. I mean, partners we choose, parents we don't. And, bosses we sometimes have some control over and sometimes don't. But as you say, the people you want around you are people who want you to be whole.
Yeah.
Right. And who accept you and love you and know you for that, for all of you. To what you said about they want you to succeed. They want you to, succeed by whatever definition you have decided for yourself, not their definition, not society's definition. The people who you really want around you are the people who want you to have what is true for you. Yeah. And to be that fullest expression of who you are. And they will love you for that, warts and all. And, we all have our stuff, and not everything, doesn't mean we're perfect, but we should be embraced as a whole person by the people in our inner circle. Those are the people you need in that community. Yeah. And so what would be like one last thought you want to leave everybody with about imposter syndrome? If they've listened to this and they think, oh, yeah, that does sound like me, dang. What would you say to them to give them hope and move forward in their lives? Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about community, and we talked a lot about, identifying what's going on and all of that, and writing down lists and all the things, but really doing that work to figure out whatever it is you need. I mean, I could list out suggestions all day, but therapy might work for me, but it might not work for you. Medication might work for me. It might not work for you. Having a big group of people around me might help me, but that might not work for you. You really need to do the work and investigate. Valerie Young's book is a good place to start. Lisa Orbe's book is a good place to start. There's a whole bunch of courses out there on Instagram, but really just trying to find out what's going to help you do this. And just because you don't figure it out right away does not mean that there isn't something out there for you. It just means you haven't found that yet.
Right.
For me, the biggest thing that has helped is me expressing my creativity in any way that I can. It may mean painting a wall for that day. I have painted my whole house in an ancient frenzy.
Very constructive use of your anxiety.
Yes, we built a camper trailer. That pictures of that is on Facebook and Instagram. That's where I go when I'm not in health, is usually building something. And my husband's like, oh my gosh, here we go.
Here we go. Yeah.
But finding just what works for you to help you get to that other side of things, something healthy, please, something healthy that helps you get to that other side. Yes. And if you don't know where to start, some of those books that I talked about, I'll make sure I send those links to Jessica so she has those. Yeah. But then also, it could be something as simple as changing your language. Just changing your language. On the show, we named it The Real Deal because we wanted people to know that they are, no matter where you are today, you are the real, authentic version of you, even though you don't feel like it. You, within you right now, are all the ingredients that you need to be authentic, and that is okay. Like, who you are today is great. It's the real deal. And I love it. I don't have to know you. I don't have to know your history and your story, but you are. And just saying that to yourself, just saying, real deal can make all the difference.
Right.
And I tell myself that all the time. I don't just say it to my guests. It's not just a gimmick. It's not just something we came up with. It's honestly something that has helped. It's helped me. And to claim that, especially if you don't feel that way, to say it will change things. It's not being fake, to say that about yourself, because I guarantee you there are people in your life who do believe that, and they're right. There's people who can see through anything that you throw at them, and they love you.
That's perfect. Yeah. And I think acknowledging all of the feelings that you're having,
Yes.
And from that place, that's where that acceptance comes that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You don't have to be perfect.
Yeah.
And you don't have to have, hit certain marks or anything to be the real deal, as you're saying, and be a beautiful version of who you are.
Yeah.
So I love that. Well, Bree, I really have loved this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and tell us what you're up to now. I know you just started season 2, right? Of The Real Deal.
We just tell us. Yeah. Oh my gosh. This season, it felt so much harder than the first season. The first season, it was just like a cakewalk almost. And then the second season was like, oh my gosh. But it's out. We are kind of coming up on the middle of the season. And this season, we kind of expanded that conversation. We are still kind of talking about imposter syndrome, but we wanted to address some of those other things, because imposter syndrome is usually accompanied by something else. Usually it's depression or anxiety. That's what we're seeing, is, that people either were depressed or anxious and it fostered imposter syndrome, or it was the other way around, but they usually show up together. And so we're talking about some of those things and just diving deeper into people's stories and trying to give them a little bit more resources by hearing that these other people went to therapy, hearing that these other people were on medication, hearing that these other people found a holistic way to deal with how they were dealing, and just hearing other people say, yeah, me too. So we've been talking to a lot of those people from a lot of different backgrounds. We just released some merchandise with a real deal plastered all over it. So if you want to, proclaim at the gym that you're a real deal, we have it. It's mostly geared toward women. My team were like, hey, you don't have anything for the guys. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll try and change that. So we'll have some more things coming out for the gentlemen out there. Cool. And then we really want to take the show on the road at some point and just do the research, more research out there. And just great to have, a neurologist or someone to hug someone up and look at what part of their brain lights up when you tell them you're great. I think you're awesome. Oh, you're so smart. You're so qualified. And see what happens with someone who's suffering from imposter syndrome, what it looks like when you say that to them, because I do believe that there's more research that needs to be done so that's where we are, and we're just kind of seeing how things are going. I am pregnant, so a lot of baby magic is going to be happening
Congratulations.
over the next few months. So yeah, if you follow me on
Exciting.
Instagram, you'll see a lot of belly bump pictures and my cute little one already, and our dog, and all the things. So
Yep. Yep. And soon baby pictures.
yeah,
Never get tired of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for being such a model for owning the feeling of imposter syndrome, because just how you're speaking about your experience, and just even with, doing season 2, and woof, it was harder than season 1. Right? Like, I think the more we all can be honest about those things, it'll really shift how we all interact and feel about ourselves and others.
Oh, thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, we're all the real deal. We're all the real deal, everybody. Have a great, great day. Bye. Thank you for listening and being part of the conversation. Please find a way to validate yourself today. Maybe find a way to validate someone else too. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also join me at No Not Crazy on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Let's build this community of validation together.